Yoram Hazony, and this is NatConTalk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. Today I'll be speaking to David Goldman, entrepreneur, political commentator, and author of a crucial new book, You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. David Goldman, welcome to NatConTalk.
Yoram Hazony, thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I'm excited to have you. And I think it's been about 10 years at this point that I've been reading your columns and your essays and later your books. And I have to share with our viewers that of all of the hundreds, maybe thousands of columnists and commentators who we all pay attention to, I think that you have had one of the very best records. I would say one of the 2 or 3 best columnists on any subject, although your range is extremely broad. You write about the Middle East, about East Asia, about American politics and American foreign policy, and also about Judaism and occasionally about Christianity. And despite this remarkable breadth, I would say that in terms of the quality of the predictions, the record of being right, and also just the fun of reading your sometimes very cutting but entertainingly cutting commentary on other writers, you're just one of the very best out there. And I've thought that for many years. At this point, you have some books out. We're going to be talking about your book on China, You Will Be Assimilated, the Chinese Plan to Sinoform the World. But before we get into that, your background is not a standard journalistic career. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you got to be David Goldman?
Well, I was awakened, Yoram, by 9/11, as so many other people were. I would write the occasional piece, mainly on economics. My background is economics. But I became convinced that there was a dimension to what we saw leading up to 9/11 and in the aftermath, where entire cultures and civilizations seem to behave in a profoundly self-destructive way. And I argued that the jihadi penchant for suicide bombing was the flip side of the coin of some of our advanced countries' willingness to wish themselves out of existence. Western Europe is going to go the way of Greece or Rome through the population. People simply don't feel like they need to have children. The one industrial country in the world with a positive birth rate in terms of population increase, of course, is Israel. And it was that question of what motivated civilizations to will themselves out of existence, or conversely, what led civilizations to persist and survive and flourish, that really fascinated me. And that's what I tried to address in many different ways over the years.
Let's go into the substance of the matter. You haven't been especially happy with the course of American foreign policy over the course of those 20 years since you've been writing that column. What is it that troubled you about American foreign policy beginning in 2001 and up until today?
I think we can summarize the problem in American foreign policy, Yoram, in one word, and that's narcissism. Or like my old philosopher Bear Stearns, Alan Greenberg liked to say, we'll be okay as long as we don't mistake our body odor for perfume. After the Cold War, the idea that this was the end of history and all the world would evolve naturally and very quickly to look like us as liberal democracies, pervaded the entire foreign policy establishment. And you had the liberal, touchy-feely, soft power responsibility to protect approach of the Clinton administration, which turned NATO into a gigantic social welfare organization and destroyed its military mission. And then you had the evangelizing export democracy freedom agenda of the Bush administration, as advised by the neoconservatives and the Republican Party, which, as President Trump said, lost us $5 trillion, thousands of lives, and got us into endless wars, which only made things worse. We've only begun to have a recovery in foreign policy under President Trump, who's demonstrated to the consternation of the entire establishment that sometimes not trying to fix the world's problems will cause a lot less damage than trying to fix them, as evidenced by this remarkable success with the peace agreement between Israel and respectively Bahrain and the UAE, as well as the recognition of mutual recognition by Israel and Kosovo's decision to put its embassy in Jerusalem, the first time a Muslim majority country has done that. That was done by the exact opposite means that Bush, Clinton, and Obama used. Trump effectively told the Arabs, we're not going to put boots on the ground. We're not going to bail you out. You're going to have to step up to the plate and act like responsible players. And faced with that problem, the most far-sighted and enlightened of the Arab leaders, the Crown Prince of the Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, decided to make peace with Israel, to the complete shock of the Europeans, the left wing of the Democratic Party, and indeed the interventionist wing of the American Republican Party, which thought that nothing but American boots on the ground would fix the region.
So, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that both the left liberal establishment and the neocon establishment, which is also a kind of a liberal worldview, that both of them had the idea that if American military presence is everywhere, I think President Clinton once said, we're everywhere. If American troops are everywhere, then that will cause somehow peace to be achieved all over the world wherever there are hotspots. And
well, indeed, the belief was that everybody was going to become liberal democracies like the United States, and we only had to bash them upside of the head sufficient times to make them understand that this is the direction in which they were headed. It never occurred to the narcissists in the foreign policy establishment that different cultures with different histories have very different views of governance and indeed very different capacities. Trump's view was, I really don't care how other countries govern themselves as long as it's not hurting the United States. So, for example, on the matter of Russia, it was a thorn in the side to the foreign policy establishment that after the fall of communism, we didn't end up with a liberal democracy in Russia. We had something like a neo-czarist authoritarian state under a very unpleasant, if very sometimes brilliant character, Vladimir Putin. Trump, as he told a campaign rally a couple of weeks ago in Pennsylvania, said, what's wrong with getting along with Russia? Is it better to get along or not get along? So for the U.S. to be able to withdraw troops from the Middle East means we have to accept that other countries are going to have a role there. For example, Russia. When Trump in September 2019 said he was withdrawing a tiny contingent of American troops from Syria, the whole foreign policy establishment, including most of the Republicans, said this is going to be a catastrophe. In fact, what we've seen is a balance of power established in Syria, where Russia has contained the ambitions of the Turks, and secondly, has given the Israelis a great deal of leeway to destroy Iranian assets under the ground. Israel and Russia aren't friends, but they've worked out a modus vivendi. Trump has a modus vivendi with Russia. And that approach has enabled Trump to use the pressure he's willing to apply to the Gulf states to make peace with Israel. One of the shibboleths of the foreign policy establishment, I just watched an old video of John Kerry saying, there will never be a peace agreement with the Arabs until the Palestinian issue is settled. That's nonsense. The Palestinian issue is only there because Arab states didn't want to make peace with Israel. That's why the Palestinians, uniquely among all populations in the world, were given refugee status to the 10th generation. Refugees are a first generation matter under international law. So now that the peace agreements are starting to come in between Israel and Arab states, the Palestinian issue has suddenly become irrelevant. It will take the Palestinian leaders a little while to figure that out, but they simply don't matter anymore. Like Hillary Clinton said What does it matter now?
So you're describing at least a generation, maybe more, maybe a couple of generations of American foreign policy making in the Middle East. And it was always said that Israel would need to give land in order to get peace, and that Israel would have to deal with the Palestinians, as you just said, in order to get peace. Now we have this seemingly miraculous appearance of what in Israel, what Israeli commentators are calling peace for peace instead of land for peace. It turns out that there are at least two, the Emirates and Bahrain, at least two countries in the Middle East, and there's rumors that there are another 3 or 4 or 5 that may be coming, who are eager to make peace with Israel under the leadership of the Trump administration. Now, what is it exactly that changed? What made it possible for there to be peace for peace and for the Palestinians to be pushed aside, at least for now?
The magic ingredient for the Gulf states was Trump's warning to them that we are not going to be here forever. We're not going to put boots in the ground. We're not going to engage in endless wars. We're not going to bail you out. You're on your own. You have to make regional arrangements for your own security. Now, given that Israel is no threat to the security of the UAE, nor indeed Saudi Arabia, but Iran is a serious threat to the security of the Gulf Sunni states. What possible allies do the Gulf states have in the region? As a matter of objective logic, their only significant ally is Israel. So for their own security reasons, as long as the United States didn't infantilize them and treat them as protectorates, they had to act responsibly. So it was the America First nationalist, if you will, minimalist approach to American intervention that changed all this. Now, of course, the Iranians contributed considerably by attacking Saudi oil facilities, by sponsoring a guerrilla war in Yemen, and otherwise indicating that they wanted to overthrow the Sunni governments. The Turks contributed by sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood with help from Qatar and trying to represent themselves as an alternative religious center to Saudi Arabia. That put pressure on the Gulf states. But above all, it was Trump saying, I'm willing to be a friend and help you, but I'm not going to be the cop on the block. You're on your own. You have to step up to the plate if you want to survive. And they took the logic from that. China is a much more difficult problem, which of course we'll get to.
Yes, so let's actually go roll back in time a little bit and talk about the evolution of China's place within world politics, because certainly I remember 20 years ago certain intellectuals in Washington who were trying to make China look like it was a significant threat to the United States, and at the time that had no traction, but because China was a poor country or a backward country, and yet here it is 20 years later, and I think your writings have probably as well, if not better than anybody else, have tracked the rise of China. You have been describing the stunning, the breathtaking improvement in China's technological and economic abilities, and together with that, its aspirations. You've been tracking that for the last 20 years. So can you tell us a little bit about what is it that we've been watching over the last 20 years? What has China been doing right? What has America been doing wrong?
Well, Yoram, thanks for putting the question that way, because in my view, what we need to worry about is what China is doing right, as opposed to what they're doing wrong. And they do a great deal right and a great deal wrong. The threat to us is where they've been reasonably successful. Remember, in the last 30 years, basically in a generation, China has increased per capita consumption ninefold, 900%. It's the fastest increase in living standards for the largest number of people in world history. That's nearly 1.5 billion people. And it's a staggering achievement. Cities which I visited more than 20 years ago, the first time I went to China, which were third world backwaters, miserable slums now look like science fiction movie sets. They're all steel and glass skyscrapers and 8-lane highways and so forth. And if you talk to Chinese, they'll say, well, when I grew up, we had an outhouse, we had a pump, we had dirt floors, and now, my parents have indoor plumbing and indoor heating, and they have a car as opposed to a bicycle. It's an astonishing transformation. China, people tend to think either of China as a United States in preparation. In other words, economic growth will lead to democracy inevitably. That was the liberal view, the panda-hugging view, if you please, for the past 20 years. And the other view is China's like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. It's a terrible place. They put people in concentration camps. They turn their dissenters into kidney donors. They suppress religion. And they're a thoroughly evil and wicked and horrible place. Both are very false portraits. China's been around for 5,000 years. The Chinese system, as we know it, was essentially in place nearly 2,500 years ago. A centralized bureaucracy selected from standardized exams, running a completely top-down economy. The closest thing to China in the West would be the Southern Italian mafia. The emperor is the capo di tutti capi. His job is to stop the underbosses from killing each other. And when you have a weak capo or a weak emperor, then you've got civil war and you lose 10 or 20 or 30% of the population, as has happened, sadly, so many times in Chinese history. But if you think about the mafia, but also it's sort of Google and Bechtel put together with commitment to infrastructure, high technology, and sophisticated education, that's what China is. I find the system repugnant, quite frankly. I would rather be dead than live in a place like China. Nonetheless, it is dangerous to underestimate what a country can do if it selects the cleverest people in the country as measured by standardized exams and gives them control of an all-powerful bureaucracy. Sometimes our democracies, which is the system I prefer, whether they're more efficient or not, I prefer democracy for moral reasons, elect idiots. And the Chinese will say, how is it possible you allow voters to elect stupid people to public office?
Right.
I'll tell them that's their right. They have the inalienable right to choose whomever they please. I hope they don't choose stupid people, but if they want to, that's our system. And they look at me as if I'm completely mad. How could you possibly do things that way? You don't meet anyone in Chinese public life with an IQ of under 150.
Now, David, your new book is called You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. And I have to tell you that it is the most impressive book that I've read on East Asia in many, many years. I actually did a degree in China and Japan a long time ago when I was an undergraduate, and I keep track a little bit. But this book is wonderful. It begins by telling your readers that China is not what it is that they think it is, that China is actually something quite different. And that on a couple of different dimensions, a few different dimensions. One of them is that you say that China is not a nation. It's not a nation state of the kind that most people in the West assume that it is. And on another dimension, you show that, in fact, the Communist Party is more continuous with the tradition of the last 2,000 years of imperial rule. And in fact, the Communist Party is kind of the communist dynasty in the continuous rule of Chinese emperors over a vast empire, effectively of many different nationalities. Now, that is both components of this description of China are they make a lot of sense to me, but I think that they're probably new to many, many people in America and Europe. Can you elaborate and explain those 2 points? China is not a nation, and its Communist Party is really not communist. It's as you're arguing, it's a continuation of the empire, the old Chinese empire.
Yoram, you wrote one of the definitive books about nationalism of our epoch, which I reviewed and enjoyed enormously. And all the things that you talk about in terms of kinship, language, mutual history, the things that bind us together as a nation, if you look at China, it's the exact opposite. If there were an alternative universe in science fiction and you wanted something most unlike what we are as nationalists, that would be China. China started as a small civilization in the Yellow River and expanded to become the largest country in the world. And with 8,000 miles of the Yangtze River and the Yellow River alone, the need for massive hydraulic works, flood control, and so forth required a centralized state. And the Chinese approach was not to absorb people into nationality the way, for example, America does. People come here and they become Americans. China made them imperial subjects. So there is no such thing as a language called Chinese. No Chinese mother has ever sung her baby to sleep in Chinese. According to Chinese government data, roughly 10% of the Chinese speak Mandarin fluently. Most of them know a little bit of it, but there are 200 modern languages in 6 major language groups spoken in China. The songs, poetry, and tales, the oral sense that we have of our history, which bonds us together as a nation, is something completely absent in China. That's a regional thing. Chinese kids spend 6 years of their life, 3 or 4 hours a day, learning a system of characters, which are not letters that spell words. They're ideograms that stand for concepts. That is an imperial lingua franca. So every Chinese has a schizophrenic identity, so to speak. You have the imperial identity, which is associated with the characters in your public life. Then you have your family and clan and regional identity. So the Chinese are most loyal to their families. The empire is something they tolerate because they need it as a source of public works and infrastructure. They reluctantly pay taxes to it. The emperor is there, as I said, as the capo di tutti capi, to keep order. Chinese will tell you, if we didn't have an emperor, we would kill each other, because there's no concept of public trust that stretches across this vast multilingual, multi-ethnic empire that China is. And the advantage they have, the glue that holds it together, is the selection process of the brightest young people into an imperial bureaucracy, which aligns their personal interest with the center against all the different constituent elements of the empire. It's that meritocracy which picks people by standardized exams, which is the glue that holds China together. And when you have an organization like that, given that geography and ethnography, it's very hard to govern China by any other means. Every conqueror who's come in, internal or external, has had to run China the same way, because there's no other way to make that kind of place work. And that's the same with the Communist Party. The People's Congress, which met in March and announced a $1.4 trillion 5-year subsidy for high technology, staggering amounts of money, 2 orders of magnitude more than we're spending here. That Congress had 100 billionaires in it. How many billionaires did you have in the Russian Communist Party? You probably have a lot of billionaires in the Putin regime, but that's different.
We talked a few weeks ago about, I wrote to you to talk to you about this question of whether you consider the Chinese Communist Party to be communist, whether you consider it to be Marxist. And I think I got you to laugh. Can you tell us what's so funny about thinking that the Chinese Communist Party is communist? Or maybe we just don't understand.
I haven't met any communists in China. I haven't met anyone who's read Marx or Lenin or is remotely interested in the subject. I did have dinner with a gentleman whose business card read head of the Marxism-Leninism Studies Department of the Cadre School of the Communist Party of China. A very nice fellow. And we had dinner, and at the end of it, he said, by the way, my daughter is graduating with a master's in business from a certain Ivy League university. Could you help her get a job on Wall Street? This is what's called Stoicism with Chinese characteristics. Chinese characteristics means every man for himself.
Okay, so uh, so I understand you to be saying that that there isn't a whole lot of Marxism left in the Chinese Communist Party. So what is the ideology? I mean, do they what do they want? What is their goal? Or let me put it this way: you said that you would rather die than live under a system of government like that in China. And at the same time, your descriptions, have a lot of, I wouldn't say sympathy, but you understand how it works. You're saying that the party is the continuation of the empire, that it's responsible for security, that it keeps people from killing one another, and that it promotes people on the basis of merit to a significant degree. So that sounds pretty good. What's wrong with that?
Well, I respect and fear the Chinese. I take them seriously. I've never liked them. I don't even like the food. The difference between China and the West is everything in China is top down. No Chinese has ever served on a little league board, a school board, a local sports organization. The imperial system sends orders down from above, so you obey orders. There are many jokes about how the Chinese don't have opinions, but they really don't have opinions because it has no meaning to have an opinion because there's no forum in which your opinion is counted. You take the order that comes down from the guy on top of you, you kiss up and you kick down. That's the imperial hierarchy. It's the purest form of bureaucratic authoritarianism in the world. Now, when you have very clever people sending the orders down from the top, you can have some, you can get a great deal of efficiency. And when, as Deng Xiaoping did in 1978, when you decide to let people get rich, and Chinese love to get rich, very most materialistic, least spiritual society in the history of the world, as far as I can tell, you can get some spectacular results. The Soviet system told people, if you're a clever engineer, make an invention, we'll give you the Order of Lenin, maybe a dacha. The Chinese say you're a clever engineer, do an initial public offering, become a billionaire. And so they have 100 billionaires in the National People's Congress, but still with very tightly buttoned down control from the Communist Party. That's not the best system. The best system is one which uses Western creativity and propensity for innovation, which is why I think ultimately our kind of society can do much better than a Chinese kind of society. But if our educational institutions turn into brainwashing facilities for resentment studies, and only 5% of our kids, as in the United States, major in engineering, and we sit in our laurels, then you have basically a tortoise and hare situation. The Chinese tortoise will catch up in the American hare. That's what I observe happening now, and that's what alarms me so much, because a Sinocentric world, a world which is Sinoform, where many countries adopt Chinese methods of governance along with Chinese technology, Chinese finance, and so forth, would be a much crueler and less hospitable world than one based on Western values.
I think that probably a lot of Americans are confused by the fact that it's possible to to get rich in China. I've had many people say to me, China can't really be, considered an authoritarian regime because people are encouraged to start businesses and they can get rich there. So there must be a great deal of freedom. How do you respond to that?
There's a good deal of freedom to get rich as long as you operate within the parameters handed down to you by the centralized bureaucracy, by the Communist Party. You can be the richest person in China, and if the Communist Party doesn't like you, you can become a kidney donor in a concentration camp the next day. I'll give you an example. In the United States, rich people can buy their kids admission to Harvard or any other university. You donate a building or whatever. It doesn't matter how stupid your kid is. The one thing Xi Jinping, the president of China, cannot do is get his kid into Peking University, China's Harvard. That's done exclusively by standardized examinations. And to get a high score on the examination is a guarantee of a good career, a virtual guarantee. 10 million Chinese kids take this, called the Gaokao. It's incredibly difficult. 5 million get university places. The average Chinese family spends a year's pay on tutoring their kids. Wow. Because the rewards for educational excellence are so great and the penalties for failure are so extreme. But that goes through a centralized bureaucracy. You're then picked out and put into an appropriate slot in the bureaucracy. This self-perpetuating elite has absolute power. And you could be Jack Ma, you could be a multi-billionaire, and if you stand up and say, I think the Communist Party is wicked and what we're doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is terrible and we should have more freedom of religion, you'll disappear the next day.
I got it. We're basically talking about a brutal tyranny, which at the same time lavishly rewards, and at the scale of billions of dollars, those people who are loyal to the regime and play the game properly and rise within the hierarchy as they're supposed to.
And remember, the Chinese, in their 5,000-year history, have virtually no experience of self-governance, a little bit at the village level, but imperial governance has always been a centralized affair dictated by the enormous needs of infrastructure, above all hydraulic infrastructure. Chinese water management of the ancient world makes the Babylonians and Sumerians and Egyptians look like children by comparison. Spectacular technology. So without this experience, they're used to having a centralized regime which tells them what to do, doesn't tell them what to think because they're not asked to think, but gives them a certain amount of freedom to pursue family life and make themselves prosperous. And that's the bargain the Chinese people have had with their government for thousands of years. It would please me more than anything else for the Chinese to adopt a different attitude towards governance, a view that it should express something divine inherent in every human being on the American model. But since they haven't had that experience for thousands of years, I think it's very unlikely that China will change in any radical way during my lifetime or indeed my grandchildren's.
One of the really dramatic aspects of reading your writings over the last decade is the consistency with which you have tried to warn Americans and Europeans, Westerners, actually people who live in democracies, about the threat of the extension of this Chinese empire. And yet at the same time, it's very striking in your book that you don't expect that the Chinese are going to use their armed forces in order to conquer one country after another. And I think that also is very difficult for American foreign policy makers to understand. How can China be such a threat if you yourself are saying that their development of a huge military and advanced military technologies, the fact that they're catching up, maybe surpassing America in lots of fields, that all of this is not intended to be used, as you understand it, as offensive weaponry. So where's the threat?
The threat is that we'll all become tenant farmers to China and dependent on their technology, on their standards, and we will, in a nuclear age of hypersonic cruise missiles and satellite killer lasers and so forth, that will effectively be indefensible against them, and that their influence will extend over the entire Eurasian continent and isolate us, and that their technology will leap ahead of ours and leave us behind. That we would, in other words, in terms of power, look like Great Britain in the 60s and 70s compared to the United States. We'd be poor and less secure. But the Chinese, who think that their system of governance is superior to ours, have never been curious about how barbarians handle their own affairs. They don't have this Russian messianic view that create communist parties, organize proletarian revolutions, send in the Red Army to occupy places. The Chinese have no view like that at all. But that doesn't make them any less dangerous in a high technology world. What we see in a high tech world is that we have a digital outcome. You don't have MySpace and Facebook. You just have Facebook. You don't have Lotus 123 and Excel. You just have Excel. Whoever the winner is it dominates everything. And if the Chinese are able to repeat the success they've had, for example, in global telecommunications through Huawei, and become the dominant player, not just in 5G internet, but in all the technologies that piggyback on 5G internet, they'll have the kind of dominance of the world that the United States did after World War II, during the 1960s. That's exactly what they're trying to accomplish. The Chinese military model is an artful imitation of what the United States did during the peak of the Cold War. What made us so effective was investing in dual-use technologies. Our military more than paid for itself because all the technologies that made us so much more powerful than the Soviet Union all had civilian applications. CMOS chip processing, first mass production of light and fast chips, was a DARPA project, 1976 at RCA Labs. By 1978, we had those chips in F-15s. They went into look-down radar. In 1982, the Israeli Air Force used those F-15s and various other homegrown technology to wipe out virtually the entire Syrian Air Force, which were top-of-the-line Russian airframes. And the Russians suddenly woke up and realized they were going to lose a war. They couldn't fight us. But all that technology paid for itself in terms of the digital age numerous times over. The same with laser optics, the same with plasma displays. Everything started with military R&D, every important technology of the digital age, but every one of them yielded much more in terms of economic growth and indeed tax revenues than the cost of developing the technology for the military. That's the Chinese model. It's a clone of the American model. The problem is the Chinese are doing it now, but we're not doing it anymore in the United States.
Well, there's a good reason why we're not doing it, because the theory of the free market, which is accepted both by mainstream liberals and by mainstream conservatives, right? The theory of the free market is something that is taught to Americans and to a large degree to Europeans also, as a kind of a indisputable picture of reality. Free enterprise is what creates wealth, and free enterprise is therefore the system that should be allowed to govern all aspects of the economy. Now, I know you very well at this point, and I know that you yourself are a great believer in the virtues of the free market and in entrepreneurship. I mean, you're certainly no socialist, and yet what you're describing is something that simply does not fit into the current free market orthodoxy. You're saying that America's great success, that its overwhelming economic success and position as the security leader of the world, that those things actually were the result of American investment in Bell Labs, in RCA Labs, in this entire chain of R&D facilities during the Eisenhower administration and going forward. Am I understanding that? Because that seems to be
that's right. We struck the right balance. there's always a risk when the government's handing out money of crony capitalism and corruption. By concentrating federal money on basic frontier science problems of the kind the military needs to address, because if you're trying to win wars, you very quickly get to the boundaries of physics, and allowing private companies to take the risk of commercialization, we found the sweet spot in terms of public-private partnerships. Entrepreneurs will risk money, but they won't risk money on the unknowns. In other words, the fundamental science. That's something where the government really has to provide subsidies. When we were creating the digital age, there were aspects of physics which were yet undiscovered. For example, semiconductor lasers, which are the foundation of optical networks and eventually cable television. We let the entrepreneurs take the risk. And in fact, engineers from big companies quit, started their own companies, and created Cisco and Oracle and Intel and the whole generation, Facebook, Microsoft, all the great companies we have today that dominate the capitalization of the stock market industry. So the right kind of division of labor, the right kind of balance is the key to this. And the Chinese have done this reasonably well. They know perfectly well that their state-owned enterprises are frequently run by stupid bureaucrats who are simply marking time to retirement, have no incentive to do anything creative or innovative. So they've allowed entrepreneurs to become fabulously wealthy. They've created hundreds of billionaires while concentrating state resources on R&D and basic science. That's the original American model. Ronald Reagan talked free markets, but in certain respects, he was a committed statist when it came to government support for defense-related basic science. So yes, there's a great deal to be said for free enterprise, but there are things free enterprise can't do, and it needs an accelerator from the government. A pure industrial policy where bureaucrats decide on every aspect of risk-taking too often leads to corruption.
So let's try to understand, how would this apply today? I mean, certainly people will say, I think people who lean right will say, look, the United States government does in fact pour billions of dollars into scientific research at various universities, and yet that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about a dramatic shift in policy in order to be able to compete with Chinese industrial policy. What would that look like?
Well, the biggest problem we have, Yoram, is that 20 years ago, our technology companies decided that it was more profitable to produce software where the marginal cost of adding a customer is zero. If you buy a new copy of Windows, you simply give Microsoft your credit card and download it on the internet. It costs Microsoft nothing. But if you do that on a new computer, Lenovo in China has to actually build the computer, and there are real costs associated with it. So software is potentially a much more profitable industry. That's the origin of what Neil Ferguson called Chimerica. It was a conscious decision on the part of American manufacturers to give up on the physical production side, concentrate in the software, and let China do it. In the early 2000s, one of the most famous free market economists, whose name I won't mention because he's a friend and it would embarrass him, gave a speech which I attended, in which he said America shouldn't manufacture anything. Manufacturing is dirty. We'll do the design, we'll do the software, let the Asians do the manufacturing. Now, that's stupid for any number of reasons, not only for national security reasons, but also because if you can't do the manufacturing, ultimately you can't do the innovation because you lack the means to test ideas and see if they really work or not. Now, it's true we subsidize research at universities, but we do so at about half the rate that we did during the Reagan years. As a percentage of gross domestic product, federal support for R&D is at about 0.6%. It was at 1.3%. So it's roughly half of what it was. But the other problem is that we've deindustrialized so much that our great, you know, companies like Cisco, for example, used to dominate telecommunications equipment production, is effectively out of the manufacturing business. They've handed that to Huawei. Now we've turned around and realized, not just for national security reasons, but for competitive reasons, the advantage that we've handed to China and indeed South Korea, Taiwan, and to some extent Japan may leave us backward and poorer indefinitely. And we're trying to find a way to claw that back. So, in a sense, we have to go back and reconstruct the kind of conditions we had in the early 1980s when the United States won the Cold War. And I think it's no exaggeration to say the Cold War was won in RCA labs and Bell Labs, IBM Labs, GE Labs, and so forth. They don't exist anymore. They've been shut down. What would it take now to persuade our great corporations to restore that kind of engineering and scientific capability and to reinvest in manufacturing? Well, I think basically it would take everything. It would take telling them you're going to be taxed and regulated in a very unpleasant way if you don't, and you're going to get all kinds of incentives if you do. It would take very powerful leadership from the top. And I started out by praising President Trump extravagantly for his improvements in foreign policy. What he has not yet done, and what he needs to do if he really wants to make America great again, is to do the specific kinds of things which did make America great when we won the Cold War. There has not been that kind of initiative from the White House, and I think that's the president's greatest omission in his administration so far.
If I might put it simply, maybe too simply, you have a particular kind of an industrial policy that you're focused on. The model is America during the Eisenhower years, during the Kennedy years, and under Reagan to an extent also. And that model involves not the United States trying to regulate all aspects of the American economy, but rather a security and defense-oriented targeted investment that of the kind that could move companies to go back into the manufacturing and basic research of weapon systems. And that will ultimately give us all sorts of technologies for all sorts of other things. Is that roughly correct?
That's exactly right. My objection is that we now do have an industrial policy in America. Our industrial policy is China's industrial policy, which is gutting us. So whether we like it or not, we do have an industrial policy. We just have to decide whether we want ours or China's.
Okay. Before we wrap up, I would like to change the subject more or less completely and ask you a couple of questions about your own personal life. I know that in over recent decades, you made the decision to commit yourself to becoming an Orthodox and God-fearing Jew, and this is the kind of thing that's not supposed to happen under, in an Enlightenment society. Certainly not, full-grown adults who have, successful careers are not supposed to do this kind of thing. Could you share with us a little bit of what happened, what motivated you to become an Orthodox Jew?
Well, I grew up in a very enlightened art, culture, music, and philosophy kind of background. And my first academic field was actually music theory. I still deeply love Western classical music. I would go as far as to say few people you will meet love Western culture and Western civilization as much as I do. But I don't think Western civilization, as we inherited it from the Greeks and Romans, is entirely successful. It has moral flaws. And I think that the Torah, the received wisdom of the revelation at Sinai as developed by the rabbis and Jewish sages over the centuries, represents a truer account of the nature of the human being and the relation between man and the transcendent. It took me many years to come to that conclusion, and even longer to accept the yoke of the mitzvot, in other words, to perform the commandments, to keep the Jewish Sabbath, to pray, to eat kosher, and so forth. And that, quite many years of study and soul searching. But it's my conviction that the Torah is truth that finally drove me.
Well, we're looking at, I think, without exaggeration, a massive civilizational crisis, which in some ways is centered in Europe, in some ways is centered in America. But there's clearly been, much more than a correlation. I think it's pretty clearly causal, that the abandonment of the Torah, of Hebrew scripture, of Christianity, to the extent that it was based on the Hebrew Bible, the abandonment of this textual and moral tradition as part of the public life of America and Europe seems to have been directly related to what it is that we're seeing now, which is I think an almost universal breakdown of norms. It's not just a breakdown of traditional morals, although it's certainly that. Any kind of traditional norm, let's say, of a democratic society, recognizing the legitimacy of the person who won the election instead of resisting the person who won the election in the streets. Every kind of norm that used to characterize the Europe and America at the height of their greatness is being undermined. And I would say probably 100 million people are searching now. What would you say to the many, many people who are listening to you right now and who are beginning to feel that something has gone terribly wrong, but they can't necessarily put their finger on it? And when somebody says to them, the Bible or religion, they say, oh, well, that's finished. What would you say?
I would say that reason isn't enough. We human beings are unreasonable, and indeed about one particular point. We want our lives to continue past our physical existence. Even if we don't imagine ourselves sitting on a cloud playing a harp, we want that life to have an eternal meaning for people who follow us. We require something sacred. So what is invariant in society? What reaches back to our ancestors and stretches to our descendants and makes our life embedded in something that transcends our physical existence? What Judaism has done, I think, more successfully than any other culture is to find a way of keeping the past alive through present practice and anticipating the future in hope and expectation and ritual and study in a way that gives life a meaning which makes it worthwhile. And the proof of the pudding is that in Israel, the average woman has 3 children, and in Spain and Italy, it's barely over 1, not counting immigrants. Without that sense of the sacred, of the enduring, of the permanent, the eternal, if you will, the transcendent, people don't find their lives particularly meaningful. They turn on themselves, they become self-destructive, they become hedonistic, and societies fall apart. So if people want a purpose in life and a foundation for something that goes beyond mere material pleasure, I think the example of the Jews and Judaism stands out among all the civilizations in the world. I'm not suggesting that non-Jews immediately go out and find a rabbi and attempt to convert to Judaism, but it's our job to set an example. We're surely not perfect, but if you look at us over history, we've done a better job of that than anyone else.
David Goldman, thank you very much for having joined us on NatConTalk. We'll continue this conversation in a future episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of NatConTalk. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss us next time.